Hey up and welcome to another episode of Last Cast. Today you join us back on the banks of the River Calder, just downstream of Brighouse, and we're actually fishing a section of the River Calder corn mill. As you can see, it's actually a weirpool, which might explain the background noise that's behind us. You'll see there's a large weir directly behind where we're fishing. And it actually creates this large pool here with some shallows there. So obviously whatever fish are in here get effectively trapped in this area, and it can be a very good and productive area of the river, holding a variety of mixed fish. A few out of season trout might turn up today, but the odds are we're looking for grayling and a few coarse fish as well. In terms of the peg, you can see it's quite shallow here and it'll slope out there, and I'm just looking to fish just beyond where that slope ends and the deepest water starts. As you can see, the flow's cutting a channel down towards the far bank, so I'm looking to fish on the slack just on the inside. The river's up by about a couple of foot today, so I think that's where the fish will be. You can see there's a nice bit of steady water there, just a couple of feet on the inside of the crease, and that's where I'm going to look to target. Hopefully there'll be some deep water there. As you can see where I'm sat, it's right up the top end of the peg, giving myself plenty of room to run the float down the peg, and as I say, get the bait down there. Obviously with the water being quite pacey, you want to give yourself as much room as possible, with it being quite a short peg overall. So considering that, all I've brought with me today is a pint of maggots, keeping things dead simple. As I say, we're only here for a couple of hours, so I've just set up two rods. I've set up two rods, one at 14 foot and one at 15 foot, both float rods. As I say, I'm just looking to fish one line today, which is in the crease there. So I'm basically looking at a stick float approach. I've not plumbed up at all. Again, that's something that I will do shortly when I get onto the peg and show how I go about doing that. The rigs are basically the same, just one slightly stepped up over the other. We'll start off on the heavier one. Starting at the bottom end, we've got a 301-2 size Daywood TDM. That's loaded with 016 Daywood TDR. Again, the line that you'll see me use for pretty much all my fishing. So nice and thin, so plenty of float control, but again, breaks about 4 pounds, so nice and strong if we hook a few big chub or a few trout. At the top end of the rig, we've got a 1.75 gram Drennan alloy stick. As you can see, both the floats are the same pattern, just in different capacities. You'll see that there's a nice shoulder on the float, but still quite a thin bristle, and a nice heavy base alloy stem. The choice of float on pegs like this is crucial, so the choice of an alloy stem means it's nice and stable in the water, but still allows plenty of capacity down the line. With a nice bulbous body and shoulder there, plenty of float to hold back against. So again, when you're trying to slow the bait down, as we're going to be doing through this pacey water, it allows you that extra bit of control. But as you can see, because the water's quite calm on the surface, it's not really boily, I'm able to get away with a finer bristle. I would use, say, a Dave Harrell stick if it was a bit more boily on the surface with a much more bulbous tip, but I can get away with quite a fine one. Again, the water's cold, it's winter, they might be still quite finicky. Moving down the rig, with this one I've just got an Olivet, as you can see there, 1.25 gram, and then I'm using number 8s as droppers, as you can see, nice and compact. And I'll look to set this float about 10-12 inches over depth and really hold back hard just to see if I can nick a few fish that way. It's a great form of presentation, that's why there's a nice heavy float for the depth that I'd expect to encounter, about 6 feet or so. So as you can see, number 8's down there, 3 set of 2, and then just a single one above the hook length, which is 10 inches of 012 fluorocarbon, and that comes down to a size 16 Drennan wide gate match. Nice heavy hook, nice and strong, but again, not a massive hook, so we're just going to be using maggots, say single, double, maybe triple maggot if the fish are feeding well, and that should work quite nicely. The second rig is the one I'm actually going to start on, which is just sort of a refinement on that first rig that I've shown you there. This is the lighter of the two. As I say, again, exactly the same kind of setup, except a 15-foot rod, slightly lighter on the main line. That's 014 on there. and the float choice is exactly the same. Dren and alloy stick, but this time in a 0.8 of a gram. Again, if it's about between 4 and 6 foot, mud number 4 per foot of depth, so it works out as sort of like what you consider the correct capacity for the depth. Again, exactly the same principle with the shoulder and all that, but the shotting pattern's different on this one. I've just got the shot spread out down the line in what you call a reverse shotting pattern. Again, number 8s, but 2 number 10s just down the line near the hook length. And as you can see, they start quite compact and just spread out. Again, this I'm going to be looking to run through the peg and not hold back that much. If the fish are being really finicky, this is also a good rig to catch them on. The hook length for this is 095 Dren and Suplex fluorocarbon. Again, line that I've always got faith in using when the water's clear, and that's down to a size 18 Kamasan B560. Again, a hook that I use for all my river fishing when I think the fishing might be quite difficult. So those are the 2 rigs. As you can see, it's going to be a dead simple approach today. Just a pint of maggots, so I'll get the bait pinny on now, get the maggots in the pouch, get onto the peg, and we'll see if we can catch a few fish. Right, so we'll now go for the first cast of the day. As you've seen, I've done a rough plumb up to try and work out sort of the contours of the peg. As I suspected, it does slope away from me quite considerably, so I'm just going to see how the float runs through and see how it goes. So I'm just starting on the lightest rig, right at the top end of the swim, and just trying to gauge where the float runs through best. As I say, when I plumbed up here, it was about a foot and a bit deeper than what I've got the float set, because when I plumbed a bit further down the peg, it does deepen off. So if I do start catching fish here, I'll have to catch them holding the float back quite hard. And as I say, hopefully as the session progresses, I'll work out where I can get that float to run through best. Might be that I have to go into the heavy rig and cast a bit further out to get the float to run exactly where I want it to, but again, it's about judging where the fish want to be on a session like this. Again, just trickling enough bait to get their confidence, but I'm trying to find where they're shoaled up, because there will be sort of a lie somewhere in this peg where there's a bit deeper water or something like that where the fish are happiest to be. Obviously in winter they're not going to move around so much, so it's rather than draw them out on a peg like this where it's quite confined, I'm going to have to try and find them. And there's a fish now. As I say, that was when I was holding the float back really hard there. This feels like a decent fish to start off the session. Not entirely sure what it is yet. See, it's just bobbed beneath the surface there. Could be a small grayling, this. But clearly there's an area of the peg where these fish are happiest to be. Which is why I've got a bite so soon without feeding anything really. And that's a lovely sized grayling to start the session. As you can see there, a fish probably about 12 or 14 ounces, that one. Really good sized fish. See there, he's taken the bait with confidence that time. We'll just try and slip the hook out of him. Again, it is quite fiddly when you are standing up to unhook these fish. And there we go, a lovely grayling to start off the session. Again, just hooked right in the scissors, so it's quite difficult to get the hook out there, but as always, when you've got a fish like this out of the water for any length of time, it's important that you just let them recover before you release them. There he goes, a really nice fish to start off the session there. So I say that one was just on the lighter rig, so hopefully if we start to build an area of the peg there where there's a few fish, we might start to catch some better stamp ones as well. But that's really encouraging, a fish on the first cast of the day. Not bad at all considering the temperatures that we've had over the past few weeks. So I'm going to do exactly the same, because clearly that works there, holding the float back quite hard against the flow. And I'm going to actually start feeding in that area a little bit more. Again, as I said, it's in the slack area of the peg, but I want to be able to run into that deeper water if possible and see if there's a few different fish knocking about. Again, it'd be nice to get a good mixture of fish today. Again, you can see just how effective holding back a float like this can be. Again, if it turns out there's a lot of fish there, then I can switch to that heavier rig, and that can be very productive as well. You can see the float's barely moving through the peg there, and that's because I'm checking the line really heavily. So I need to make sure that hook bait is past the float. What I don't want to do is have it arcing towards me. So what I'm going to do is try moving this float around the peg a little bit more, really working sort of the areas of the peg that I think the fish might be sat in. So I'll try this cast a bit further downstream and draw it up a little bit more. So again, that'll probably be in some deeper water against that shelf. The feed, I'm just putting into that crease in the river. So hopefully what it'll do is draw the feed into the slack areas there, and that's where the fish will be, is lying up against that slope. As I've said, with the river being up slightly, I wouldn't expect them to be in the deepest water where it's really pacey. And where the float's running now looks like quite a nice area of the peg to get a bite. Again, because it's running through there and it's a little bit deeper, I'm just going to let it run without checking the line quite as much, just to see if I've got the depth right. That looked like a little bit of an indication there. So again, just feeding 5 or 6 maggots at a time. Not trying to concentrate them too much in one area, because again, I don't want to build a peg where I can't really fish effectively. So I'm just trying to feed generally into the flow and get the bait to spread itself out as it runs down. Just trying to sort of spark the fish into feeding a little bit and hunting out the odd maggot that might be drifting down. You can see that part of the peg there, the float's actually starting to drift towards me a bit more, so it's almost stationary, so I think I need to be just past that really to start catching a few fish. Again, I'm just having to suss out the peg today as we go along, which is no bad thing really, because it's not like I've done a lot of river fishing over this winter with the conditions being as bad as they have been, so it's nice just to get a bit of practice. It's a bit of debris on the hook there, so I know that bait was well on bottom there. So again, I'm just going to flick that this time a bit further out into the flow and see how that runs down. Again, just following it up with a couple of maggots, just generally in that area. As you can see, that float's running through quite nicely there, so if I'm not getting bites there, I'd suspect there's an issue with the depth. But because the river's trying to push the float away from me, it's nice and easy to draw that float back up the shelf towards me. So it could be a good area to catch a few fish in this peg. Not sure if we just bumped one there. Yeah, definitely a bite that time, the maggots come off. So as I was saying, that looks like a nice little area of the peg to catch a few fish. Obviously when you do find somewhere like that in the peg that you're fishing, it's always worth taking a note of the distance and the far bank marker, because effectively it is a feature within your own peg that you can fish to. And that's where, especially when the fishing's really good, you can establish sort of a killing zone, if you like, somewhere where you can catch the bulk of your fish from. An area where you'd expect to get bites every single time the float goes through. So on a good day, that's what you're looking for. So what I've done is taken note of the far bank marker of where that float was sat, and also roughly the distance out. Again, just using the crease of the river as a reference point. Then obviously I'm going to start working the float around this near side area where I'm feeding as well, because that's where I got the previous fish from. So again, if the fish are coming to the feed, what I can do is work this area of the peg a little bit more. Just holding the float back really hard and just trying to hit every little indication. Grilling can be quite finicky this time of year. So again, I'm not going to spend too long waiting for the float to go under in a certain area. Obviously, as I feed more bait, then I'll start to establish the peg a little bit more. And I can try and gauge where the fish are happiest to feed. So again, just going to try another couple of foot further out this time. Just let the flow pick up that float a bit more. Obviously, when you're fishing a peg like this, where there's a lot sort of going on in terms of with the weir and the different flows and the different sort of contours on the bottom, it's important that you do keep checking the line and really control the float as best you can. Again, that's going to give you a gauge of how the float's running through and where sort of different areas of flow are within the peg. That float's run into that area that I sort of earmarked earlier where I missed a bite. So I'm just going to let it run through there at the normal pace of the river, just checking it very lightly. Just see if we get an indication there. Looked like a little bit of a bite there, so I'll just bring that in and check the maggot. And if it turns out that I'm missing a lot of bites in that area, then I can always pick up the heavier rig and really control the float and almost stop it in that one area of the swim where I think the most fish might be. So again, it's early doors, we've already had a fish which is good and a couple of bites. So it's just a case now of really sort of knuckling down and trying to suss out the peg as the session goes on. As I say, we're not here for too long, so I'm not going to mess around too much with the peg. I'm just going to focus in on one or two areas and see if I can nick a few fish from there. So this cast, I've just put it a bit further down the peg and a bit further out into a bit more flow. Again, just to see if there's anything there as well. The river's now in that area of the peg pushing the float much further out towards the centre. So that'll be an area of the peg where that heavier rig will probably come into effect a lot better. The float's running through nice and cleanly there. So again, I might be able to add a couple more inches to the depth if I do choose to fish that area of the peg with this rig. Looked like a little bit of a bite there. But again, with the nature of the peg how it slopes towards me, what I'm going to do, if I miss a bite like that, I can just let the float reset and start to drift out again that way. Again, just gives me more bites of the cherry and allows me to cover that bit more water with each cast. Yeah, there's one. Right, we're into another fish now. Interesting, what I've done there is shallowed up by probably about 1.5 foot and tried to work around this inside slack a little bit more. And just by holding the float back where, as I say, it was almost stationary earlier, I've just had a bite out of the blue there. Another decent sized grayling this time. Probably a little bit smaller than the last, but again, still nice fish to catch. Again, you can see lovely lean fish these. That's quite interesting, that I've worked the deepest section of the swim where it's a bit faster pace wise for no reward. So we'll pop him in the net, get him released. But just by working around sort of this inside area here where it's almost stationary, the float, I've just had a bite there quite quickly, probably within the second chuck of running it through. So I think what I'll do is leave this rig set at this depth. As you can see, I've taken quite a bit of depth off it, just to make sure it's just tripping bottom. It's probably only an inch over depth there around this area. And then I'll actually start to use the heavier rig further out, just in case I think there's a few fish there as well. But I'll keep working this for a short while and then just see how the session progresses. Again, obviously fishing closer to me in this instance allows a lot better float control, especially with the light float like I'm currently using. And also it allows me to concentrate on where I'm actually feeding a little bit more. So I'm literally feeding just off the rod end really, just to make sure that I'm not getting too far into the faster water. So I'll just quickly sort this out and then we'll have another run through. So as I was saying there, we've still probably got a good 5 or 6 foot of depth where I am fishing, but the area that I'm concentrating is this inside slack right under the rod tip basically. So I'm literally feeding just about there, and then that's allowing me to run the float through, basically controlling it from right under the rod tip where this crease is. As I say, I had that first fish right under the rod end effectively, so they might be feeding quite aggressively, or coming to the feed I should say. So it might be a case that a lot of the bait that I am feeding is getting washed into this inside slack where the flow is basically coming back on itself. So again, get the odd little indication. Sometimes that will be a rock on the bottom or something like that, because it is quite a rocky area that we're fishing in today, right under this Weirpool. Again, keeping the bait to just 2 or 3 maggots at a time. Then just really concentrating on that float there as it's running through the peg. As you can see there, the float almost does sort of a 90-degree turn to my left when it hits that point in the river. I think that's because of the sort of flow that's coming from that side of the waves pushing across there. So it might be a case that any bait that I am throwing in there is ending up in this area, or this slack I should say, just in front of me here, rather than making it into the main flow. So again, something to think about a bit more. If I come back to this peg in the future, I'll definitely have to spend a bit more time plumbing up. As I say, today I didn't spend that long doing it because we've not got too long on the bank side. But obviously, say it was match conditions or I had a bit longer during the day, then I'd certainly spend a good half hour even plumbing up and just making sure I know exactly where the contours of the peg are. Again, all the bites I've had today have been really nice and positive, as I say, using that nice fine bristle on this float, although it is becoming slightly harder to see with the turbulence of the water. I've just bumped a fish off there. The bites are really nice and positive. Probably a grailing that one as the bait's not damaged. So as you can see there, flicking the float out, as always with stick float fishing, especially when you're using strung out rigs like this, you must stop that float in mid-air just to allow all the shot to straighten out and the rig to sort of organise itself. Otherwise you'll end up with a lot of tangles, especially with turbulent water like this. If you get a small tangle very quickly, it'll suddenly become a lot worse because of the turbulent nature of the peg. So as soon as I've cast out, I'm just following the float up with 3 or 4 maggots, and then just really concentrating on the float. and almost around this area where I'm fishing now, I'm pretty much holding it on a tight line and not letting any more line off the spool. And there's a fish on now. Just as I was saying there, holding it really nice and still, and straight away that grayling's had it. Another nice fish this time. As you can see, just holding it on a tight line, not only does it improve bait presentation in that area, but also it means that you're much quicker on the strike. As you can see, that one's just nicked right in the top of the mouth. So again, they can be quite fiddly to unhook grayling when it is like this. You're standing out in the water, so it's worth just taking your time, making sure you've got everything to hand, which where one of these bait aprons does help. And there we go, another lovely size Calder grayling. There's plenty of energy in him, so we'll get him straight back. Again, lovely size fish to be catching these. So it does seem that I'm starting to suss out the peg just a little bit more now. Again, when you do fish rivers quite regularly, you'll know when you are getting things right, and you'll be able to sort of preempt a bite quite often, especially on a peg like this where, as I say, it's quite featureful. So what you can start doing when you do know where the fish are going to be, you can start to cast a bit more towards that area. Again, just cutting down on the time spent waiting for the float to get to where you expect to catch. As I say, that bite was exactly what I was describing, where the float suddenly starts to make a run sort of more to my left as I stand straight onto it now. So just by holding it back in that area, being able to get a bite straight away. Again, I'm sure with the amount and stamp of fish that there are here in this peg today, in summer you could obviously get through a lot of bait somewhere like this. So again, a really interesting little peg to fish. Obviously the one thing you do have to tolerate when you are stood in the water like this at this time of year is just how cold it is. But again, when you're catching quality grayling, it's all good. Obviously this isn't a peg that you'd be able to fish effectively from the bank at all, and it is essential that you do wade out just to get that float control. Again, as you can see, I'm able to keep nearly all the line out of the water. Again, that's where having a 15-foot rod helps massively, and also being stood out into the river like we are now. So hopefully I should get a bite somewhere around this area. Bit of an indication there. Yeah, we'll have another go in that section. Again, as you can see, I'm just getting that rig a bit further out now to make sure it does move into that area of the peg where I was getting bites just that little bit sooner. Again, I've had a couple of fish from that area, so I don't want to ignore it and cast straight into the area that I'd expect to get bites. But it's all judging where your maggots are going to be starting to reach bottom and where those fish are sat and picking them up. So again, you can see the float there barely moving. If this area of the peg does dry up though, I've always got the option to go onto that heavier rig and start to explore a bit further down the peg. So again, it's always worth just setting a couple of rods up just to give yourself those other options. Right, and there's another fish now. Again, just playing around with where I'm working the float this time. And I've just gone back to that area where I caught the first fish of the session, effectively right in front of me. And just by holding the float back a bit harder there, managed to get another one of these grayling. So again, I've had a few casts around that area where I had the previous fish with no real success. But this one's had it straight away. I've missed a couple of bites there as well. Again, you can see hooked really cleanly. Just try and find my disgorger. Bit smaller this time, but again, still lovely fish to catch on a day like this. It's again a bit of a nightmare to disgorge when they are hooked as awkwardly as that, but again, another nice little grayling. So get him popped straight back. So I'll just try and explain on this next couple of runs through exactly what I was doing there. Again, just catching all on a single maggot again. We'll give it a short while before I do look on that heavier rig if it turns out there's one or two fish in front of me. Clearly there's a couple of fish that have turned up in this area of the peg, just nicking off the maggots just before they start to move into that area a bit further down the run. And because I've been feeding there, they've clearly gained quite a bit of confidence where I've not been fishing it. So all I've been doing is just popping the rig in nice and close into me, feeding a few maggots around it and then just letting it run just in towards it, where, as I say, it starts to turn effectively to the left. I'm doing exactly the same, holding that up. Just a bit of a bite there as well. Holding the float up just to make sure I'm quick on the bites. So I've just been laying the rig in like that, flicking a couple of maggots around it and then just letting the float start to run down the peg. And just by holding it back quite hard, we managing to get a couple of bites there. As I say, that last one we managed to hit it. So that fish there was caught somewhere around this area of the peg where the float is now. Again, it gave a really nice positive bite just as I was holding the float back. So obviously when you're doing that, that maggot's rising and falling, and as soon as the fish picks it up, you'll suddenly get a much more positive bite than if the float was just running through normally. Right, so unfortunately there we've not managed the last fish from this section of the river. We've had a few runs through but no bites. It clearly seems that obviously where we've caught a few fish, they've just started to back off and they've not really settled anywhere. So as I say, we'll get the bits of kit moved down, probably another couple of 100 yards further downstream. We'll give it a go there, see if we can get a few different fish for the last hour or so of daylight. Right, so as you can see now, we're in a different peg. We've just moved down a couple of 100 yards downstream to an area of the river where it's just a little bit steadier and just slightly deeper, only by a couple of inches after plumbing up. But we're just going to use exactly the same rigs and tactics. As you can see, we've got a tree on the inside and I've had to wade into the water just to get a good presentation. And what that tree does is creates just a bit of an eddy in front of me and a bit of a slack. And as you can see, the flow starts to push out towards mid-river. So I'm just fishing that same sort of lightweight stick float about 2-3 rod lengths out and just trying to work it around. There's a bit of an overhanging tree down towards the bottom end of this run, so that might hold a few fish. So again, just for the last hour of light or so, just going to see if we can try and get the odd bite if we're lucky. Again, we've not had to change the rigs or anything, just using exactly the same kit. And I've just got this one set probably about an inch over depth or so. It's just starting to drag on bottom a little bit by that tree. So the peg just seems to shallow up by a couple of inches there. As you can see, just having to be really careful flicking the rig out because there's a bit of a tree on the upstream side of me. Can't quite sort of swing the rig out as I would normally, so I'm just sort of laying it in, just really carefully, swinging it out past the rod end, and just laying it in like that. See there, also the bottom of the river here is a lot different. It's very much more silty, a bit of clay as well. Like a bit of an indication there. Again, what I'll do is keep shallow up by about ½ an inch at a time so it starts to run through cleanly, but first couple of runs through there. Just again, just trying to get a good reading of what the peg's like. Again, sticking to 3 or 4 maggots each run through. As I say, hopefully if we're lucky we'll just catch 1 or 2 fish from this peg and be able to conclude the session at that. Again, these floats are pretty much perfect for this part of the river as well. You can see it's quite pacey, so again, using a decent shoulder on the stick float means I can just hold it back, but again, that fine bristle is even more appropriate for this section of river than it was up nearer the weir. So again, it's just a case of working this rig around on this near side of the river. Again, I've always got the option to switch to the heavier rig. That float there is just going a bit too far past that near side snag, so again, just important to make sure I avoid that when I'm drawing the float back in. Bait looks all right that time. So again, just going to go another probably half rod length further out this time, just see if there's anything there. Again, obviously wading into the water allows me a lot more control when I am fishing like this. So again, it's just important to consider that as well. So the bank sides are a bit steep here, so it's a bit dodgy, but again, just trying to get the best float control I can, especially when conditions are difficult like they are today. So again, just checking the float as it's running right down to the bottom end of the peg. Nice long run here as well, so I can see a fair distance down. Don't think that was a fish that time. The float's running quite nicely down there, so hopefully it should mean that when we do get an indication, it should be a fish that's a hittable bite as well. So as I say, I'll keep plugging away at this, and hopefully if we're lucky we'll encounter 1 or 2 fish before we start to lose the light a bit too much. Right, and there's a fish on now. Nice little bite right under the tree. Again, feels like a decent fish this. It's not taken too long for that bite. Not entirely sure what it is yet. Could be another small grayling down here as well. Again, while that fish is under control, it's dead easy just to flick a few maggots out, get into mid-river. This one once again just came as I was holding that bait back a little bit more. Yeah, much smaller fish compared to the ones we were getting up by the weir, but again, nice to come to a different peg and still catch a few fish. See there, just nicked in the side of his mouth. Just try and slip the hook out. There you go, another lovely River Calder grayling. So hopefully if we're lucky we might get another couple of these and possibly a few different species as well. Right, so as you can see there, we've just had that nice little grayling, but I'm just going to switch on to that heavier rig just to see if we can tempt another better fish. If I can't, then I think for the last couple of chucks of the session, to try and get a fish to end on, we'll just switch back to that lighter rig. But again, we'll just play it by ear a little bit. So obviously with this rig being a bit heavier, set a little bit more over depth, I can hold it back a lot harder. Again, exactly the same principle as what we were doing further up the river. So again, just picking out a decent sized maggot. Then just going to lay that rig in. Then loose feed over the top and just let that rig settle and start to run down the peg. So it'll be an interesting exercise just to have a couple of runs through before we do start to lose the light too much and we have to conclude. It'll be interesting just to try this rig and see if it does produce a couple of fish for us. And straight away there's one. I'd suspect this is a little trout. So clearly these have come right up the peg, and using that heavy olivette to get right down really quickly, you can see straight away we've had that bite. Again, able to put a little bit more pressure on the fish with the heavier gear. Just scoop him up. Again, not really what we're after today, considering that they are out of season, but again, change species from the grayling that we've been catching. As you can see, not a big fish, but again, nice just to get a few more bites. You can see he's definitely feeding aggressively because he's taken that bait well down. So just take a second or two to get this hook out and then we'll get him released. There you go, lovely little brown trout. So I think we'll have another couple of chucks with this, see if we can get any more fish. As I say, then probably conclude the session on that lighter rig, just seeing what we can scratch around for at the end. Right, so I'll just swing that rig out again, exactly the same process. As I say, amazing just how close to where that feed going in that trout has been sitting. Just missed a bite then again immediately. So as I say, as the light levels have dropped, they've definitely come right up to that feed area. So again, with that previous one taking it probably before the last couple of droppers had settled, it might be a case they're actually coming up there to try and intercept the bait as much as they can. Another bite that time there. Just going to take an inch off the depth just to make sure that the line's a bit tighter between the hook and the float for registration of the bites. But amazing just how many fish are feeding on a day like this. It just shows we've been able to catch on both rigs today. Although this heavy rig wasn't particularly successful up towards the weir, it's clearly tempted that trout as a change fish on this peg here. It's always interesting just to have a couple set up, just to chop and change between them. So the float's bombing under each time it runs through there, so I'm not entirely sure whether that's a snag. So I'm just going to start to hold the float back even more in this case. I'm just checking every single coil of line as it comes off the spool, and I'm going to just run this through a bit further out towards the middle of the river. It's definitely a little indication there. So there's certainly a few fish feeding. A lot more fish down there than I expected. Yeah, you can see the maggots being nipped, so it might well be small grayling or just generally other small fish down there. But whatever it is, there's plenty of them, and they, as I say, getting by every sort of 5 feet that the float runs in that case. Definitely with the dropping light levels, the fishing's picking up. And there's another fish on now. Again, looks like a tiny little grayling this, and it is. These are what we're clearly missing bites off. Still lovely little fish though, and it shows that the Calder's going to be strong for grayling fishing for the next few years to come, especially when you're catching grayling of that kind of stamp. So again, just managed to hook that one by holding the line really tight there and striking at the slightest indication. So just flick out again and just see if we can get a couple more fish. Again, using that Olivet means I can hold the line really tight. Just missed that one that time. So I'll just try it running through on the inside a little bit more again. I would say that just kind of proves how useful this rig with the Olivets can be, or with the Olivet can be. So I was missing a lot more bites on the sort of strung out rig. As soon as I've gone onto this heavier rig, I've managed to nick a couple really quickly by just keeping that line really tight between the line, the float and the Olivet. Right, and we've just hooked another fish now. It's taken a while for this bite. It doesn't look like anything big, but I think we'll probably call this the last one of the session. As you can see, the weather's closing in now and conditions aren't great. Interesting, that's another, what's that now? Looks like a tiny little grayling, that one. So not the biggest fish to end on, but as you can see, we've had a nice session today, getting a few bites up and down the river, trying a few different pegs. Obviously on this one, these have probably been what we've been missing bites off, but again, lovely little fish to catch on a cold winter's day like this. So again, hopefully there's one or two things you can pick up from our video today on river fishing, how to approach a couple of different pegs, just keeping things simple, a few maggots, some nice simple rigs, as I say, just catching a few fish on a hard day. So as always from Last Cast, thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on that next episode.